168 men, 80,000 warriors, a golden litter carried by nobility through a plaza surrounded by stone buildings. Every strategic calculation said the Spanish would be annihilated, crushed by an empire that stretched from mountain peaks to ocean shores, an empire that had never known defeat. They weren't. This wasn't about superior weapons or better tactics. This was the moment when psychological warfare proved more devastating than any army, when capturing a single man could paralyze an entire civilization, when the unthinkable became reality in less than an hour. What happened in that plaza involved terror no Inca had ever imagined. The thunder of gunpowder, the screaming of horses, and a trap so perfectly sprung that thousands died without landing a single blow. Behind those buildings waited men who understood that survival required the impossible. To understand how an empire of millions fell in minutes, you have to picture the Andes in November 1532. The Inca realm sprawled across a landscape of impossible verticality. Cities carved into mountainsides, roads threading through clouds, fortresses perched where eagles nested. For generations, the Inca had expanded relentlessly. Their armies moved like landslides, overwhelming kingdoms, absorbing cultures, leaving behind a single authority, the Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, son of the sun itself. But divine blood had spilled. A civil war had just concluded. Brother against brother, army against army. Atahualpa had emerged victorious, crushing his rival Huascar in battles that left valleys choked with death. Now, at the height of his power, Atahualpa commanded forces numbering the tens of thousands, warriors hardened by recent combat, loyal generals who had delivered him an empire. He was camped near Cajamarca, a town nestled in a highland valley, preparing for his triumphal march to Cuzco, where he would claim his throne properly. Then came word of strangers. They had arrived from the coast months earlier, bearded men with pale skin, riding creatures no Inca had ever seen. Horses, the reports described with confusion and awe, four-legged beings that moved like thunder, carrying men who wore shells of metal. The strangers numbered barely more than 100. They brought thundersticks that roared and spat fire. They had been observed from a distance, their movements tracked, their weaknesses noted. They sweated in the cold mountain. They gasped in the thin air. They stumbled on paths that Inca runners traversed without thought. Atahualpa was intrigued but not concerned. 100 men, even exotic ones, posed no threat to an empire. If they came seeking trade, perhaps that could be useful. If they came seeking conquest, they would learn how empires dealt with foolishness. He sent envoys bearing gifts, observing the strangers' reactions, gauging their intentions. The bearded men, led by one called Francisco Pizarro, requested an audience. They wished to meet the Sapa Inca himself. Atahualpa agreed, perhaps generously, perhaps arrogantly. Perhaps he saw it as an opportunity to impress these foreigners with Inca majesty before deciding their fate. He instructed his armies, 80,000 strong, to camp in the fields and hills surrounding Cajamarca. He would enter the town with only his personal guard and nobility, a show of strength tempered with confidence, a demonstration that he feared nothing. The Spanish arrived in Cajamarca on November 15th, 1532. 168 men total, 106 infantry, 62 cavalry. For small cannons, 12 arquebuses, primitive muskets that took minutes to reload and misfired as often as they fired. They entered a town that had been emptied of its inhabitants, its streets silent, its plaza vast and open. From the hills above, thousands of Inca campfires blazed like a constellation brought to earth. Smoke rose in columns that merged with the evening clouds. The sound of drums rolled down the slopes, rhythmic and relentless. Inside the Spanish camp, terror ran as thick as a mountain mist. Men urinated where they stood, unable to control their fear. Pedro Pizarro, the conquistador's young cousin, would later write that the stench of fierce sweat filled the buildings where they hid. They had walked into the heart of an empire with no escape route, no reinforcements, no possibility of retreat. The mountain passes behind them could be sealed with minimal effort. The army surrounding them could crush them like insects beneath a stone. Some prayed to saints whose names they'd half forgotten. Others sharpened swords with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The rasp of steel on stone a counterpoint to their whispered fears. Pizarro gathered his officers as darkness fell. Candlelight flickered across faces drawn tight with dread and desperate calculation. The conquistador was nearly 60 years old, illiterate, born to poverty in Extremadura, hardened by decades of violence across the New World. He had learned his craft from the conquest of Mexico, where Hernán Cortés had captured the Aztec Emperor Montezuma and held an empire hostage through one man. The plan Pizarro outlined that evening was audacious to the point of madness. They would invite Atahualpa into the plaza and seize him in plain sight of his own guard. The officers started, one emperor, surrounded by thousands, 168 exhausted Spanish soldiers hiding in buildings around an open square. Success seemed impossible, but Pizarro understood what his men were too frightened to see. They were already dead if they did nothing. Retreat meant pursuit through mountain passes where a handful of defenders could stop an army. Negotiation meant revealing weakness. Waiting meant the Inca would discover how few they were, how far from reinforcement, how completely trapped. The question wasn't whether to gamble. It was whether to die passively or to reach for something beyond reason. The infantry would conceal themselves in the long stone halls flanking the plaza. The cavalry would hide in the narrow alleys. For groups, each positioned to charge from a different direction. The cannons would be placed in a stone building at the plaza's center, aimed at where Atahualpa's litter would likely arrive. No one would move, no one would make a sound, until Pizarro gave the signal. Then they would strike with everything. Overwhelming violence delivered in a single instant, calculated to create maximum shock. The soldiers took their positions before dawn. Hours passed. The morning stretched into the afternoon. Men stood in shadows, sweat mixing with fear, muscles cramping from enforced stillness. The horses, hidden in the alleys, stamped and snorted softly. Their riders whispered to calm them, knowing that a single whinny at the wrong moment could reveal their presence. Outside, they could hear the Inca camp stirring, voices carrying across the valley, the shuffle of thousands preparing to march. Some Spanish soldiers prayed silently. Others gripped their weapons until their hands ached. All of them understood that the next hours would determine whether they saw another sunset. The waiting ended around mid-afternoon. A procession emerged from the Inca camp, descending toward Cajamarca. First came men wearing a livery of checkered colors, red and white squares arranged in patterns that signified imperial service, sweeping the roadway clean with small brooms, singing as they worked. Their voices rose in harmonies that predated Spanish music by centuries, complex and strange to European ears. Behind them marched attendants in elaborate dress, feathers in gold and silver catching the highland sun. Hummingbird feathers are iridescent green, condor plumes black as obsidian, gold plates hammered, so thin they moved like fabric in a breeze. Then came warriors in formation, though they carried only ceremonial axes, polished copper and bronze, edges dull for display, handles wrapped in dyed wool. They moved with the precision of professional soldiers, but their weapons remained sheathed or held at rest. This was a ceremonial entry, not a military advance. And in the center, raised above all others, rode Atahualpa on a golden litter covered with parrot feathers, scarlet and emerald and sapphire blue, and plates of silver that blazed with reflected light. The litter itself was a masterwork, carried by 80 men, all of them nobles of high rank, dressed in brilliant blue tunics that marked them as members of the imperial household. The Sapa Inca sat motionless, his expression distant, regal, untouchable. He wore a fringe of red wool across his forehead. The imperial lauda and enormous gold discs hung from his ears, stretching the lobes in a style that marked Inca royalty. Around him pressed his retinue, advisors, generals, priests, family members, thousands of them filling the road like a river flowing into the valley. The procession moved slowly, deliberately. The bearers stepped synchronized so perfectly the litter barely swayed. The singing rose and fell in complex rhythms that echoed off the valley walls. They passed through the town's entrance and flowed toward the main plaza. The streets remained empty. No Spanish soldiers visible. No sounds except the Inca voices and the whisper of brooms sweeping stone. Some of the Inca attendants exchanged glances. Where were the strangers who had requested this meeting? The litter entered the plaza and stopped at its center. Atahualpa's bearers held him high, motionless as stone. The attendants spread out around him, filling the square. 6,000 people, perhaps 7,000, pressed into the enclosed space. They looked around at the empty buildings, the silent doorways, the strange absence of life. The square could hold them all, but barely. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a sea of elaborate dress and curious faces. From inside the stone building at the plaza's edge, a single figure emerged. Friar Vicente de Valverde, dressed in his Dominican robes, carrying a cross and a breviary. An interpreter named Felipillo walked beside him, an indigenous man who spoke both Quechua and a rough approximation of Spanish learned for months with the conquistadors. They approached through the ranks of Inca nobility, who parted to let them pass, though some muttered at the foreigner's audacity. The friar stopped before the litter and looked up at Atahualpa. What Valverde said next has been recorded in multiple chronicles, each version slightly different, but all agree on the essence. He announced himself as an emissary of God and the Spanish king. He demanded that Atahualpa accept Christianity and submit to the authority of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He spoke of salvation and damnation, of the true faith and rejection of false gods. His voice carried the certainty of a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. The words, filtered through Felipillo, who barely understood theology in any language, emerged as confusion. Atahualpa listened with an expression that shifted from bemusement to irritation. He asked questions. Who was this god? Where was this distant king? By what right did strangers make demands of the son of the sun? The friar handed him the breviary. Atahualpa examined it, turning the pages, studying the strange marks that held no meaning to him. Then he threw it to the ground. Some accounts say he shouted defiance. Others say he spoke with cold disdain, dismissing the Spanish claims with imperial contempt. The core fact remained. He rejected everything the friar had demanded. Valverde retreated quickly, his face flushed with anger or fear, or both, calling out that the heathens had refused God, that they had insulted the holy book, that the emperor had condemned himself. Pizarro, watching from a doorway with his hand on his sword hilt, raised a white scarf and waved it once. The cannons fired. The sound shattered the afternoon, a roar that echoed off the surrounding mountains, louder than anything the Inca had ever heard. Thunder lived in the sky, not in metal tubes wielded by men. Smoke billowed across the plaza in thick clouds that stank of sulfur. Before the echoes faded, before anyone could process what had happened, the Spanish cavalry burst from the alleyways. Horses exploded into the packed square from 4 directions simultaneously, massive animals moving at full gallop, their riders screaming war cries that mixed Spanish and Arabic words, bells attached to their armor ringing with manic intensity. The infantry charged behind them, emerging from doorways and colonnades with swords drawn, arquebusiers firing sporadic shots that added flashes of light to the chaos, voices raised in coordinated terror. The effect was total, instantaneous, overwhelming. The Inca had never seen horses before. The creatures appeared in their nightmares now. Giant beasts crashing into human flesh with the force of moving boulders, trampling bodies beneath iron shod hooves, biting with yellow teeth, rearing and striking with front legs. The cavalry swung swords from height, cutting down attendants who stood frozen in shock or tried to flee with nowhere to go. The gunfire, what little there was, added to the sentry assault. Flashes of light, thunderous noise, the acrid stink of burning powder mixing with the smoke from the cannons. Panic detonated through the plaza like a physical force. Thousands of people tried to flee simultaneously in a space with only a few narrow exits. They crushed against each other, trampling the fallen, screaming. The Spanish pressed inward with brutal efficiency, cutting through the mob toward the one target that mattered, Atahualpa's litter. The bearers held firm. As Spanish soldiers hacked at them, severing hands and arms, they didn't drop the litter. When some fell dead, others rushed forward to take their place, using stumps where hands had been, holding the wooden poles with arms that ended in bone and bleeding flesh, dying to keep their emperor elevated. The litter swayed, but didn't fall. Inca nobles threw themselves between the Spanish blades and their emperor, forming human shields, accepting death without resistance. Some grabbed at Spanish sword with bare hands, losing fingers but not yielding. The carnage around the litter intensified, bodies piling up, blood turning the stone pavement slick, the golden platform tilting wildly as more bearers were cut down. Pizarro fought his way through the chaos on horseback, sword drawn, focused entirely on reaching Atahualpa. The press of bodies was so thick his horse could barely move. He struck left and right, clearing a path, his face set in grim concentration, when a Spanish soldier raised his weapon to strike the emperor. Seeing only a target, not understanding the value of a hostage, Pizarro blocked the blow with his own sword. The parry left Pizarro's hand bleeding, torn open by the blade's edge, the only Spanish casualty of the entire assault. The litter finally toppled when too many bearers lay dead or dying to hold it upright. Atahualpa tumbled to the ground, his royal fringe falling from his head. Spanish hands grabbed him, dragged him through the carnage toward the stone building as the massacre continued around them. He remained silent, his face showing shock that had frozen into something beyond expression. The son of the sun, divine ruler of millions, was being hauled through mud and blood by men who reeked of fierce sweat and metal. The slaughter in the plaza lasted less than an hour, though to those trapped inside it must have felt eternal. The Inca attendants, unarmed except for ceremonial weapons, offered almost no resistance. They ran. They died. They crushed each other against the walls, trying to escape through exits too small for the fleeing thousands. In their desperation, they broke through a section of the plaza's perimeter wall, a 15-foot stretch of stone that collapsed under pressure of bodies pushing against it. Those who escaped through the breach fled into the fields where Spanish cavalry ran them down, pursuing survivors until darkness made further killing impractical. 2,000 Inca nobles and attendants died in the plaza. Perhaps more. The chronicles vary, some claiming 5,000, others 7. All agree the square became a charnel house. Bodies stacked so thick that movement required stepping on the dead, blood pooling in the spaces between paving stones, the air thick with the copper smell of slaughter. The Spanish suffered a single casualty, one enslaved African who died in the initial charge, and Pizarro's wounded hand. Outside the town, the massive Inca army, 80,000 battle-hardened warriors who had just conquered an empire through civil war, did nothing. They heard the cannons. They saw the smoke rising above the town walls. They watched their fleeing comrades stumble from Cajamarca with tales of horror, and gods riding monsters, and thunder that came from metal rather than clouds. Messengers arrived breathless, incoherent, describing impossible things. And the army stood paralyzed. The Sapa Inca, the divine center around which their entire world revolved, had been captured. The son of the sun was in enemy hands. Without him, there were no orders, no authority to command an attack, no structure to organize a response. The generals looked at each other, waiting for someone to give direction that only the emperor could provide. The soldiers gripped their weapons and waited for orders that would never come. The entire command structure had been decapitated in an instant. The army simply scattered into the mountains over the following hours and days, abandoning their weapons, their camp, their supplies, their purpose. They melted away like snow under an impossible sun. An empire had been paralyzed through the capture of a single man. The aftermath settled over Cajamarca like the smoke that drifted from the ruined plaza. Spanish soldiers, exhausted and still shaking from fear and adrenaline, secured Atahualpa in a stone room. Guards were posted. The emperor sat quietly on the floor, his regal bearing intact despite the blood and chaos. He spoke calmly through interpreters, showing no panic, no pleading. He began negotiating for his release almost immediately, offering a ransom that stunned even hardened conquistadors. He would fill a room, 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, with gold objects up to a line marked 8 feet high on the wall, and he would fill an adjacent room twice over with silver. The Spanish agreed. For months, treasure poured into Cajamarca from across the empire. Golden plates, ceremonial vessels, intricate sculptures of animals and gods, elaborate jewelry, artifacts of civilization that had worked precious metals for centuries, objects that represented artistic traditions stretching back generations. Llama caravans arrived weekly, laden with wealth that made the conquistadors' hands shake as they unloaded it. The Spanish melted it all down, destroying irreplaceable art to make it easier to divide and transport. The amount collected exceeded anything the conquistadors had imagined. Roughly 24 tons of gold and silver, worth millions in modern currency. Atahualpa kept his word perfectly. The Spanish didn't. Pizarro, pressured by his men who feared an uprising, who saw Inca armies reforming in the distance, who wanted the treasure secured before something went wrong, charged the emperor with conspiracy, with secretly ordering attacks, with planning treachery. The trial was a formality. The verdict was predetermined. On July 26, 1533, Atahualpa was strangled in the plaza where he had been captured. He had accepted baptism moments before, converting to Christianity to avoid being burned alive, a small mercy that allowed his body to remain intact for burial according to his beliefs. With the emperor's death, organized Inca resistance effectively ended. The empire, which had survived wars and droughts and political upheavals, couldn't survive the loss of its divine center. Regional governors didn't know whether to fight or submit. Armies didn't know who to follow. The Spanish exploited every fracture, installing puppet rulers from the royal family, aligned with groups who had resented Inca domination, conquering a civilization from the inside out. What happened at Cajamarca wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration of how psychology can shatter armies, how centralized authority becomes a catastrophic weakness when that center is removed, how 168 men with a ruthless plan could achieve what no conventional military assault could accomplish. The Inca weren't defeated by Spanish steel or gunpowder. Those were merely tools. They were defeated by the unthinkable made real, their god emperor bleeding in Spanish hands, their worldview collapsing faster than their empire, their entire system of authority paralyzed by a single act of calculated violence. The plaza fell silent eventually. The bodies were removed. The blood was washed away by mountain rains. But the echo of those cannon shots rippled across centuries. They marked the moment when the New World learned what the Old World had perfected through generations of warfare. That battles aren't always won by the largest army. That capturing one man can be worth more than defeating 10,000. That terror, properly applied, multiplies force beyond any calculation of numbers or weapons. Cajamarca proved something empires forget at their peril. That concentration of power creates vulnerability. That an army without orders is just a confused crowd. That sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one that kills the most people, it's the one that paralyzes them from acting at all. And that a civilization built around a single irreplaceable figure can fall as quickly as that figure can be pulled from a golden litter and dragged into darkness, leaving an empire of millions standing motionless, waiting for commands that would never come again.